Warning: the podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast, The Murder of Alex Johnson, Part 1 of 4. Thank you for joining us at the Murder Police Podcast. I am Wendy.
And I'm David. Well, Wendy, what do we got in store for the listeners?
Well, we have a 4-part mini-series. It's the 2013 murder of Alex Johnson in Lexington, Kentucky.
Interesting. Yeah, and then as a mini-series, we're going to do it like we usually do, is instead of having everybody wait for every other Tuesday, this one will drop, and then every episode will drop until it completes. That way we're not waiting 2 weeks for an episode. Everybody gets it every week.
Yes, this is a really interesting case, and I don't think our listeners will want to wait 2 weeks. This certainly has a lot of cliffhangers, and the case is just really a bizarre case. I don't know how else to put it.
It is, and it's tragic. It's there's a lot of it that they're going to hear that makes it tragic. It starts out as a missing adult, which they're going to hear how those are handled a little bit differently, and some of the challenges with that, especially initially from the detectives. And by the way, we've got Detective Rob Wilson and our good friend Detective Schoonover are going to be the two that handled this one. But what you're going to hear is that when they do get these and their intuition kicks in, or when the family is giving them enough information to leave them believe that there's suspicious circumstances, just the things they go through with checking hospitals, jails, traffic crash reports, everything that to look for these people, just in the very beginning, all the work goes into it. And then it'll evolve, and we'll listen to how the things like technology and cell phones come into play. And we've heard that on some other episodes, too, about the value of that technology.
Yeah, we have. And in this case, it certainly was no different. A lot of technology went into it as far as tracking and different leads from other people. And it's just very exciting. And that's all I'll say about that.
Well, before we start, too, as I want to refer people to another excellent 8-part series podcast by a journalist in our area named Kristen Flum. It's P-F-L-U-M, common spelling. She did a fantastic series on this called Taking Alex, and I just want people to take a listen to that because it dives into completely different directions than where we're going to go today.
Okay, well, with that, let's lead into part 1 of 4 on the case of the murder of Alex Johnson.
Let's go.
Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast. Today we will be discussing the 2013 murder of Lexington, Kentucky native Alex Johnson. With us are the 2 homicide detectives that work the case, Mr. Rob Wilson and Mr. Chris Schoonover. Rob, how are you today?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. We can't wait to hear about this case. This is the first time we've had you here with us, so welcome, and we hope to have more of your cases.
That'd be great, yeah.
Chris, welcome back. We love having you here.
Thanks for having me back.
Rob, why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience, your history, your time with Lexington Police, and just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Lived in Lexington since I was 10 years old. I moved up here from Corbin, Kentucky in 1980, I believe. Went to Lafayette, then went on to UK, and then decided to settle into a career in law enforcement. Got on the department July of 1998, so here in a month, it'll be 23 years. Believe in 2002, I transferred up to the Bureau of Investigations in the Robbery Homicide Unit, and I've been up there ever since. So coming up on 19, 20 years as a homicide detective.
Wow, that's a lot of time, and I'm sure you have many, many cases that you can share with us, and I didn't know you had that much history in there. I would have been picking your brain before now.
Yeah, no, it's been a while.
What got you interested in law enforcement and policing, Rob?
Dave, I really don't know. I got my degree in history at UK. My plan was to go on and get a PhD and teach history at a small southern college and, have a great, wonderful life. And my problem was I took a year off of college, came back and realized I had forgotten how to study. So it was really tough to get back into the groove of things. And then things like, God, I'm looking at another 2 years for my master's, 3 years for my PhD. I can't really do that. So talked to some friends, my family, initially thought about going to federal law enforcement, FBI, ATF, and talked to some people in those agencies. And they're like, well, what you need to do, and I'd got my degree at that time, go to law school or go 3 years at a local law enforcement agency and then apply. Kind of did that. About 2.5 years on, I started the process with the ATF, made detective shortly thereafter. And then that process took another 1.5 years. And by that point, I'd worked with other federal agencies, nothing against them, but I realized that the real work is done at the local level. Special agents have to get approval from the U.S. Attorney's Office to make charges and stuff like that. So it was more hands-on at this. And I'd already just fallen in love with investigating homicides. So chose to stay and didn't really regret it.
That's interesting because in this day and age right now, currently people are questioning whether to get into it. Another thing, too, is when I teach at community colleges, a lot of kids are always talking about wanting to go federal. Mm-hmm. And they use words like, well, I'll start and just transfer over. And I'm like, well, it's not quite that way. So you probably just helped a bunch of people understand how that's played. And you made a good point that federal work is important, but it's a little bit different at a local level. I think we'd all agree there that the hustle is a little faster, probably. So good deal. Thanks. I was just curious about what got you interested in it.
Well, Chris, some of our listeners have heard your bio before, but for those who have not, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. In 1986, I joined the U.S. military and was recruited into the Criminal Investigative Division. It's CID as the acronym. Government always has acronyms for everything. I stayed there for 7 years, came to Kentucky with the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and got hired by the police department in 1996. In 1997, January, I got moved upstairs to the homicide division and was there until 2017 when I retired. So that's just a brief synopsis of my career.
Well, thank you. We're pleased, as I'm sure our listeners will be, with the experience that both of you gentlemen bring to the table. And I have to guess, since both of you all had been up there so long, you probably had the pleasure of working with David up there, I'm guessing at some point.
I don't know if pleasure is the word.
Yeah, did you
Probably
say pleasure?
Exactly.
Let's look for another word.
Yeah.
I'll get a thesaurus out and we'll find the right one.
We probably can't say it on here.
True.
Well, as I said, we're going to be talking today about the 2013 murder of Alex Johnson. Why don't you all tell us a little bit about our victim, Alex, before we dive into how this case came to be?
Alex was loved by many. A very kind, outgoing person, loved the outdoors, was, I believe, working on his master's at the time this was going on. He'd hoped to open up a school to help bilingual children. Alex was fluent in Spanish, so he was really wanting to give back. What people didn't know is that Alex was big into selling marijuana. He'd made a connection down in North Carolina, and Alex was a avid outdoorsman, hiking, climbing down at Red River Gorge, and he became the connect for that source to the people at the gorge, and it became very profitable. So that's really what led to his demise. And it's funny because people will always come up and say, I can't believe you kill someone over marijuana. And it's like, it's simply currency. If we woke up tomorrow and you could sell tulips for $400 an ounce, people will be murdered for tulips. It's simply currency. So you can think that it's not a big deal, it's not a bad drug, but whenever you're dealing in narcotics, there's guns going to be involved and then bad decisions are made. So it really doesn't matter what you're dealing. It can get you killed.
And in this case, I guess that's what happened. So why don't you all tell us what each of you all were doing, who was lead, what happened when that call came out to you all?
What a lot of people don't know is probably there are two separate rotations for homicide detectives. We have an on-call detective in the unit that covers that 24-hour period. If he gets a call in the middle of the night and said, hey, we've had a killing, it's not his responsibility. We have a separate rotation for who's up next to be the primary on that murder. So Chris was on call that evening, but I was next up to be the primary in the homicide investigation. So Chris was the first one to get the information, so I'll let him go ahead and take off.
As usual, as I've told your listeners before, the detectives' lives are not the normal lives. That's why the wives are important to understand and support your family. Like any other case, December 24th to a homicide detective is not Christmas Eve. It's I'm on call. The family reunions and family gatherings are secondary. So I was at my in-laws. Really, I love my in-laws. I didn't ask them to call me while I was at a family reunion, but
that would never be done.
No, not with any of us. So we were having Christmas Eve dinner at my wife's family, which it's a tradition. And I was on call, and Rob was next up on the homicide list. So I knew if anything would happen that I would just assist Rob if he needed to come out. Lieutenant Maynard was the lieutenant of robbery homicide at that time, and he called around 8 o'clock that night. He said that he received a call from a sergeant on patrol and that there's a family that's reporting their son and brother missing. And they reported him missing on December 23rd, the day before. Patrol did their job and did their checks. He went over to his apartment, went upstairs, knocked on the door, did certain things that they normally would do. So Lieutenant Maynard said, I know it's Christmas Eve, just see what you can do. The family's really worried. He was expected to be at their house on Christmas Eve, so he never showed up, and that raised a lot of flags. So I told him I'd go into the police department and do some research and some background and do the typical things I should do. So I contacted the local hospitals. I contacted any traffic units in the state police if there were any accidents, because the weather was terrible that year. And so I did that, and I started going into research on if he had had any history with anybody with violence or burglaries in his apartment or landlords or anything like that. And nothing really stood out. Made some calls to out-of-county hospitals. Very often, we don't know these victims. Very often, we're still going to check the mental health facilities because they may check somebody in. And Christmas time is a very important time that wears on people for their mental health. So I did want to do that. I did find that he had a couple burglaries at his apartment about a year previously. It was the landlord that went in, and Alex had changed his locks. And the landlord didn't like that without Alex telling him, so he went back in and changed the locks. So I did that, and I waited till the next day. The next day, obviously, was Christmas. I woke up. I have a 6-year-old son at that time. We were opening gifts, and I received Alex's father's number, and he had called me. And he's just a wonderful gentleman. My heart goes out to him. He begged me, please, to just go into work and please help find his son. I said, I'm going in right after I eat my breakfast. I'm going to go in. In between that time, I had gotten a call from a private detective. And I bring this up for one reason. If you're a parent and your child is missing, you're going to do anything you have to, regardless of what day it is, what time of year it is. And that private detective called me, and I knew at that point we need to get on this. And so I dropped what I was doing, called Rob because I knew he was up, and everything was very suspicious. Christmas time, to stay away from your family is unusual. So Rob agreed to meet me in the office that day. And previously to that, the police took a good missing persons report because they told us that he was supposed to go camping. Even though the weather was freezing, he was an inexperienced outdoorsman, and he had planned to go hiking at the gorge and camp out overnight. So we had to make some calls there to see if anybody had to be rescued or who may have seen him on the trails. And we heard nothing of that. Rob and I met in headquarters, and thank goodness that Rob and I work well together because we surmised a plan that kind of just fell in place,
Real quick, I can't remember how many, but you'd have to say there's probably hundreds of missing persons reports filed on adults alone, right? Would you agree?
Yes,
Does that sound about right?
Absolutely.
Just for the audience, what are the things you look for? Because the reality of it is, and you all experienced it too, is for every suspicious, legitimate missing person I probably had 20 where they just left. And it makes it very difficult
Yes.
to decide where to put the effort. What are some of the things that draw your attention to one to say that this is sticking out a little bit early on?
Well, I think it was that Alex was a normal person and his family was a normal, logical family. You could almost sense in their voice that within the first 2 minutes that something was seriously terribly wrong. Now, I still didn't think any foul play had happened. Once I heard about the winter camping, I was like, he's gone out there and slipped and fell in the gorge. So that's probably what happened because, as you know, 99% of the missing persons cases are solved in a day. It's the boyfriend has just left. He's tired of his girlfriend nagging him. She files a missing persons report. He's just gone to Georgetown to stay at his brother's and not told her where he is. But this one early on, Chris and I both had the feel that something's not right. So it was really just kind of a gut feeling that this is going to be something. Now, whether it was going to be a murder or an accidental death in a car wreck or slip and fall at the gorge, we knew that based on speaking to his family, he would not just completely ignore them over those 3 days leading up to Christmas when he was expected back in Bowling Green on like the 23rd.
So you let intuition come into this quite a bit? Gut feelings? Does that play a little bit of a role?
Yeah, I knew something was wrong. Now, we didn't know until a day or two later that the feeling of foul play might have been involved, but I knew that this wasn't some bogus missing persons complaint. Something bad had happened to Alex, what we didn't know at that point.
Good deal, thanks.
And the sister had let us into his apartment, and there was really nothing outstanding that really stood out in the apartment to tell us he left under pressure or someone broke in, kicked the door in, and then closed the door behind him. Nothing. So really, when we first on the onset, we were worried, but nothing pointed us in any certain direction of this is foul play.
So how do you know where to begin? If the apartment's not in disarray, the family hasn't heard from him, there's no reports from hospitals or any things that you had followed up on, where do you begin?
Luckily, we were told after the police report had been reviewed, we were told that Alex had a girlfriend by his sister. And the girlfriend had a conversation with him on the 20th. And that's where we started. Rob had contacted her after we found this out, and that's where we started.
Yeah, the main thing you want to do is create a timeline however you can, and it's just following step by step. Find the person that last spoke or saw him. So you go from there, and what we found, speaking to friends and stuff, Alex's girlfriend, she was in Connecticut at the time. I think she's a nursing student up there. They were on the phone, so we spoke to her and we were able to get a timeline. And quickly from that conversation, we learned that they had talked for approximately an hour, and this was all verified. We did search warrants for the cell phone records. They spoke for approximately an hour and 40 minutes, and her recollection was there was a knock on the door. She could hear Alex open up the door, and she knew Mark Taylor because she had been down here, and Alex and Mark were friends, and she heard Mark say, "Hey, come on downstairs. I've got a surprise for you." Well, this was around Christmas, so she just assumed that he'd gotten her a present. And to further verify that it was Mr. Taylor's identity, he spoke to Lisa and said, "Hey, Mark's here. I got to go. I'll call you later tonight." So immediately, as an investigator, we need to talk to Mark Taylor. So that Christmas morning, I think, we got in about 10. We let our kids open some presents and came back into work. And it seems like we didn't go back home for about 6 weeks.
Oh, wow.
It was a long.
It felt like that.
Yeah. So we start talking to all of Alex's friends, and we're calling them on Christmas Day. And they're like, "Absolutely, I'll come in. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Whatever you need. We love Alex. We want to do whatever we can to help find him." And so we get a hold of Mark Taylor or leave a message. Then we get a call from a relative who's also an attorney, says, "Hey, Mark's a little spooked. What do you all need?" It's like, we're just simply wanting to talk to people that knew Alex and maybe give us an idea of where he might be. He's like, "Oh, okay. I'll talk to him and I'm sure he'll be willing to help." And it was later that day that we get a call from a different attorney who said, it's like, "Hey, I know you spoke to Mr. Taylor's relative. I've represented him in the past. I will be his counsel. What do you all need?" It's like, "Well, we need him in here as soon as possible to do an interview." And he's like, "Okay, I'll make it happen." Several hours later, we get a call from that attorney, and he's like, "Hey, Mark doesn't want to talk to you all." And that's when that feeling of, okay, something's not right, because everybody else on the planet was doing everything they could for Alex. And now, from our knowledge, Mark was the last one to speak or see him, and he's not wanting to talk to the police. So that's when I think Chris and I were like, okay, this may be a criminal investigation as opposed to simply a missing persons.
Well, sure, especially when everybody else was so open to
Yes.
come in and do whatever they could. I think if I were you, and maybe you all did feel this way, when the first attorney called, I would have thought, why is an attorney call? Nobody else had attorneys call back on their behalf.
It depends on the type of person you are. If you've had dealings with the police and maybe you've had a bad dealing with the police, you're not necessarily trustful of them. And I get that. There are those encounters out there where they may have gotten a speeding ticket and maybe the officer wasn't very nice to them and they have a relative that's an attorney. We didn't really think much of that. But when the second attorney called and said he's refusing to cooperate, we knew something was wrong.
So at that point, if he's refusing to speak to you all, how do you gain any more knowledge if he's the last known person to have spoken?
So earlier, Rob mentioned that he had gotten phone records. So for any listeners that don't know, of course, constitutionally, we can't go after people's phone records unless we have a very good reason. But since Alex was missing, there's exigent circumstances that we can call the telephone company and let them know that we need the records for that. And so we got the records for previous few days of Alex, and we reviewed those, and that's what led us to, hey, we had text messages from Mark, and we had text messages to other friends. And so that's who we started with our interviews on Christmas Day. And he was the only one out of all those friends on those phone records that didn't refuse to come in, actually.
Wow. So then how do you, as investigators, go about getting him in if he's not wanting to come and speak?
There's no way to get him in. If he doesn't want to come in, he doesn't come in.
So then what are you to do? How do you go to step 2?
Well, what we did is we interviewed those friends that were willing to come in, and we found out that they'd seen Mark at a bar called Trust downtown the night that Alex went missing. So we interviewed all those individuals. One of them was Timothy Ballard, affectionately known as Tiny, for it's a funny nickname because he's 6'8", 450 pounds. We later found out that he'd done 20 years in an Alabama prison for kidnapping and robbery. And once he got finished with that, he did 3 years in federal prison for sending a letter to President Bush threatening to kill him. So we knew that we were dealing with Mr. Ballard, but Detective McCown and Detective Smith went to interview him just to get a baseline, because that's all we were doing at this time, several witnesses. We just want to get their information, then we'll go look at it and see if some pieces are missing. So Mr. Ballard gave a statement that, yes, he and Mr. Taylor were together that night, and they both went to Trust Bar at 9 o'clock that evening. And we spoke to several other witnesses like, yeah, I saw Mr. Taylor there. He was at Trust, but I want to say it was a little later. So Chris made a call and was able to get video from the entrance of Trust Bar. So the next big step in that was the information we got from the video that really poked holes into Mr. Ballard's statement.
When you saw him, or did you see him, or did you speak to him first?
Well, it was actually Detective McCown and Detective Smith that spoke to him initially. Chris and I were interviewing other people, so a lot of people in the unit really assisted in this case. It was a team effort on this.
I'm just wondering what it was like to see somebody that big.
Steve McCown came in, and Steve's waist like, that's a big old boy. So he was, they both made him like, I don't want to tussle with him. He was an extremely large guy, and we knew about his violent past. So,
sure.
So everybody was a little cautious when dealing with Timothy.
And I'm guessing that knowing of his past and that he was with Mark, maybe did you perhaps think, oh, he's had some kidnapping and bad dealings before, and this is a missing person? Did you kind of cue in on,
yes,
maybe that's what this is?
Yes. Well, when you get information like that and there's a missing persons and you learn that, oh, there's a kidnapping charge in the past, you certainly don't want to get blinders on and lock into that, but you really do keep that in the back of your mind as a potential, important piece of information.
And I was going to say 20 calendar years.
Yes.
That's a big deal. That's an indicator for people that don't know. That's a long time to be in a smokehouse. And that had been a heavy charge to do that. Let me ask you all something before we get past it based on your experience. You mentioned cell phones and records and video. In your career, was that always a powerful thing, or is that something that's relatively new? And how much value is that in an investigation these days?
At my age, it was relatively new. I mean, flip phones were fantastic when I came on board, right?
Chris still had his pager.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, I still remember his first car. He had to operate with his feet to the floorboard like the Flintstones. So,
but yeah, no, there's no disagreement. I don't think, is it, Rob? That cell phones, video nowadays it's just part of your investigation. It's a habit. But back in our day, Dave, you needed a spot of blood that was the size of a quarter to even get the type.
Oh, for sure.
From a crime scene.
Yeah,
so things have changed quickly with investigative techniques.
I remember the defendant was Scott Malm. It was a murder that then Detective Matt Brotherton was working, and it was the first case that we used cell phone tower information. And we actually had to create a drug nexus to the killing so the DEA could get a search warrant for our cell tower. And that proved to be a very vital piece of evidence in that case. And as investigators, we just learned this was a new thing. We were like kids in a candy store. So from that point, I want to say it was 2003, 2004. But after that, we were using it in every single case. And yes, it has helped solve many, many crimes.
But you got to go back to your basics. Can that detective, when they find all this information out and put the puzzle together, can they speak to people, interrogate people, and get them to admit the worst thing that they've done in society is kill another person?
Oh, right. No technology will ever take place of elbow grease and wearing out your shoes, no doubt. And the ability to communicate, we've talked about that before, that's mission critical.
Well, I've actually just went to a cold case seminar in D.C., and I'd found that to be true just in my own year as the cold case investigator. Only 3 to 5% of cold cases were solved by DNA. I would have assumed that it would have been much higher, but it's exposing fractured relationships in cold cases. And that is what you're talking about, this knack to be able to speak to other individuals and pull information, whether they're wanting to provide it or not. So that talent in an interview room is something that can never be overlooked. You can have all the science and the technology, but if you can't get in the box with somebody and talk to them and get to extract information, then you're probably not going to last long in the world of investigations.
Especially the relationship. I may or may not have kind of quietly watched people for a couple of years to find out when they fell out, because that old saying, hell hath no fury like a woman. I probably laid, I'm not kidding, a few cases down based on somebody that got mad at their old man and had enough. And that's a big deal. But you have to be patient to watch for that opportunity and jump on it.
Absolutely.
Now, for reference, how old was Alex and Mark and Tiny? I'm wondering if Tiny's already served 20 years the first time. How old of people are we talking about?
Mr. Ballard was approaching 40 at this time. Mr. Taylor and Mr. Johnson were, I believe, late 20s, early 30s.
So Tiny had done half of his life in prison already.
I believe he was 19 when he was convicted and had only been out a year and a half. So yes, he'd spent half his life in prison.
So you get these names in the video from the trust bar, and you find out that it doesn't exactly match up, but Tiny's admitted that he and Mark were together that night.
Yes, he said they got there together at 9 o'clock, and we did not find Mr. Taylor and Mr. Ballard coming into the bar until 11:40 that night.
So do you ask him at this point? Or are you thinking, well, maybe he's just off on his time. It's holiday coming up weekend. You're going to a bar. You might not be on the time as much as you think you are.
Right. The good thing about this case is I always tell Rob, it was very interesting working this case. We got a chance to, as Dave says, you could take your time on this investigation. We had a feeling that Alex was already dead at that point. After Christmas Day, the way Mr. Taylor was acting, the information we got from Tiny, we knew that, we still want to try to find him, but right now our priority is to get the people that did this. So what we do, the great thing about time was we got to kind of profile Tiny Ballard, get his personality, find out what he's doing with Mark Taylor. Why is somebody like that involved with Mark Taylor? So in that time frame, like I've told everybody before, there's a lot of things going. There's a lot of cogs in the wheel. So we have Steve and Detective Smith talking to Tiny, and it wasn't a mistake that Rob asked them to go talk to him. Steve is a very down to salt of the earth kind of guy. And Chrissy Smith is the same. She's very soft spoken. So we felt send those two. It doesn't come across as harsh. Like I look harsh. I'm just old, and weathered. And Rob comes across as very direct. So it was good that Rob directed those two to go talk to Tiny. And they gave us good information on the way back. So once we see them on the video in Trust, which was several hours of reviewing, I think over 8 hours, you can see his role. It's amazing. You can just realize why he's with Mark Taylor and who Mark Taylor is when they're coming through that door. You can kind of profile him, for a lack of better terms. We discovered that Tiny was really supposed to be Mark Taylor's bodyguard. Now, why does Mark Taylor need a bodyguard? He really doesn't, but he wants that persona that he is somebody he's not. So he has a big guy, opens his car door for him. We see it on the video, and he walks through the club. That's what he wants. And Tiny plays that role for him.
Yeah. And we learned all this as the investigation went on, especially after I spoke with Tiny. He's not the most intelligent man. He's easy manipulated, but Mark is a gregarious, very popular, charismatic man that everybody spoke highly of. And Chris is right. That video from Trust, I think we got to see it on the 27th of December. It should be a course in body language. You could see Mr. Ballard come in with shoulders slumped, even as large as he is. He looked very passive. Mr. Taylor was very aggressive, outgoing, even dancing, smiling. We later learned that they had just killed Mr. Johnson 2 hours before. And he was dressed up and having fun like he was at the Oscars. So it was really telling once we saw that, and then we're able to figure out the relationship dynamic between the two. And Wendy, you mentioned earlier, like, what do we do? Like, when we sent Steve and Christy to interview Tim, it's not to get a confession. It's to get that baseline statement. We don't want to scare them off. Thank you so much for helping. This is really going to aid the investigation. This family's going through hell. Thank you so much for your help. So they feel like they're part of the team, even though he knows that he was involved in it. It's that relationship. He's like, oh, I'm helping them. It's a bizarre scenario that you go through between suspects and investigators. We play roles, they play roles, but you get all those statements and whatever, and you look at what's missing here. And the video was huge, and everybody else's story panned out. So now we've got that Mark, and by Mr. Ballard's statement, Mark and Tiny were together, and Mark was the last one to see Alex, and their story is the one that has holes in it. So at this point, Chris had been on the department or in the unit 2 to 3 years, probably more than that, before I came up to homicide, and he was kind of my mentor. And it's like, let the evidence guide your theory. Don't get a theory, because then you will start picking evidence that fits your theory. So we were very careful, even though Mr. Ballard had a record of kidnapping and robbery, violent crime. It's like, oh, okay, that's important, but we're not going to, laser focus on these guys. But after seeing the video, speaking to more people, and we were able to get a search warrant for Mr. Taylor's phone, I'd say 2-3 days in, we were comfortable in thinking that Mr. Taylor and Mr. Ballard had something to do with Mr. Johnson's death. And we did. We believed he was deceased at that time. There was no more. This wasn't a missing persons case. It was going to try to find Alex's body and then prove that someone had murdered him and figure out who that was. So 2 to 3 days, I think we were comfortable in focusing in on these guys as our suspect.
Hey, there's more to the story, so go download the next episode like the true crime fan that you are.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com. which is our website, and it has show notes for imagery and audio and video files related to the cases you're going to hear. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, LinkedIn, and YouTube, which has closed caption available for those that are hearing impaired. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or wherever you download your podcast from. Subscribe to the Murder Police Podcast and set your play to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.